Welcome to OVA Hour number 5. I'm here at the Buck Institute. A few years ago, we launched a moonshot effort to tackle female reproductive aging with the help of the ECHO Foundation. We established the Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality here, which is the first facility that focuses solely on reproductive longevity and equality as it relates to aging. And essentially, we want to figure out what leads to reproductive decline in females and develop interventions to slow or reverse it. So to strengthen and broaden our reach, we then launched a global consortium whose goal is truly to build an intellectual network of scientists in academia and in biotech, thought leaders, ambassadors from all over the world. And our goal is to promote a collaborative dialogue about women, aging, and health. And we're pioneering something here that we think is going to have some major societal impact. So as part of building this amazing network, I get to talk to people who work throughout this space, thought leaders, physicians, scientists, entrepreneurs, and funders. And I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to some of those people here on the OVA Hour webinar every month, Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time, as we discuss how we're building out this ecosystem. So my name is Jennifer Garrison. I am the founder and director of the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality. I'm also a professor here at the Buck Institute. And I am very delighted today to welcome Deena Emera. So welcome, Deena. Thank you.
Excited to be here.
Yeah. Deena got her master's degree in anthropology from NYU. Then she went on to get her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale, where she studied the evolution of pregnancy and periods. She did a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale looking at the evolution of hands and brain. And so I invited Deena today because I think what she does is fascinating. And before we dive into the science, what I wanted to ask you first, Deena, is what does an evolutionary biologist do? I'm not sure that everyone in the audience will actually know that.
Yes, I actually get that question a lot. So I think many of us get interested in this field just with the simple observation that life on this planet is just incredibly diverse. So, we are just one of thousands of species of mammals. Mammals are just one group of many different animals. Birds are just incredibly diverse, insects. And so I think that observation for many of us turns into, well, why did that diversity evolve? How did it evolve? So for me, that second question, how it evolved, is what I find particularly interesting. So how did animals go from laying eggs to growing their babies inside their bodies? So those are the types of questions that we're interested in.
Okay, that makes sense. But okay, day to day, what does your professional life look like?
Yeah, so I think, that is also pretty diverse. I can tell you some of the work that I've done. Some of it involves, doing experiments. So doing experiments in cells from different species and comparing, something that we're interested in, how, a cell from a human functions compared to a cell from, a mouse. A lot of what we do is comparative. So we're comparing DNA sequences of a human compared to, other mammals, for example. It depends on the question. So I'm sure a lot of my day-to-day is what you do, experiments.
Okay. All right. Got it. I got it. I understand what that means. So you are writing a book about the evolution of female biology. It's broad. It encompasses aspects of all of the things that you've worked on during your training, but it also includes the evolution of menopause, which is what I was fascinated to talk to you about today. So, the question of why human females go through this reproductive decline in midlife, we're very strange as a species. I mean, this is a very unusual strategy that we've adopted.
Oh, yes. Menopause is extremely puzzling, thinking as an evolutionary biologist. So, it's all about passing on your genes. So that's, what we think about. The individuals that did well in the past passed on more of their genes, more of the traits that allowed them to pass on more of their genes. So you've got this species that basically where females stop reproducing halfway through their life. And that just doesn't make sense. So
I
it
think we
turns
have a
out,
slide about this, right?
yes.
Let's see. So the evolutionary tree, aside from humans, who else goes through menopause?
Yes, so there are very few species. So I'm going to focus here on mammals. So on this slide is we construct a lot of these trees. So this is a family tree of the mammals. Humans are all the way at the top. And then you've got this group of toothed whales. So that includes beluga whales, narwhals, killer whales, and short-finned pilot whales. They also experience menopause. And really when I say that, I mean, they stop reproductive cycling and then they live for decades beyond that. So that is the puzzle.
Okay, that is very puzzling and also shocking that there's no other species that go through menopause aside from these whales. So I think if we want to understand why we experience menopause, then we're going to need to take a deep dive into, I think, some female biology that maybe not everyone thinks about every day. So if we start at the beginning of reproductive life with menstruation, tell us, why do we menstruate? Why did that evolve?
I mean, unfortunately, with many of these questions, we don't have solid answers, but I think in many of these cases we have good leads. So there are a lot of people thinking about these questions. Actually, I am one of the people who's thought a lot about the evolution of periods. So I can talk a little bit about that. So this, I think to talk about periods, we should remind ourselves of what a menstrual cycle is and what menstruation is.
And we do have a slide about that as well, if you want to talk about it with a picture.
Yes. You know, the average menstrual cycle in a woman is about 28 days. And some key events. So, you know, the period starts on day 1 by definition, and ovulation happens about halfway through. So the tissue that I want to talk about is the lining of the uterus. So this tissue is called the endometrium. I'm just going to call it the lining. And a lot is happening over the course of the menstrual cycle to this lining. So, you know, initially on day 1, we're shedding the lining. And part of that shedding involves some bleeding because there's a lot of blood vessels embedded in that lining. And then the first half of your cycle is the shedding and then building it up again. So the cells are dividing and you're regrowing it after all that shedding. And then after ovulation, a key thing happens. So there's a switch from your ovaries making estrogen, which is the signal to get your endometrium to build itself up again, and the switch to progesterone. Progesterone is a really important hormone during pregnancy, and it becomes elevated in the second part of the menstrual cycle. And this signal tells your endometrium, the lining of the uterus, to transform. So it's not really telling it anymore to build up. It's telling it to transform into a tissue that can support a pregnancy. And this transformation is critical to understanding why menstruation evolved. So just keep that in mind as we keep talking about this.
Okay, so the lining of the uterus changing is the crux of everything.
Yes.
It seems like a lot of wasted energy.
Yes.
Just on the surface. So why do we menstruate then? Who else menstruates?
Yes. So maybe I could start with what some of the crazy ideas have been in the past. So people have wondered about this for centuries. So for example, the ancient Greeks thought that, you know, men and women eat about the same amount of food, but men are much more active. So menstruation is a way to like get rid of all that unused nourishment.
Okay, so that's obviously not right.
Which is obviously wrong. I would say that the modern conversation really started in the 90s. And in it, biologists really wanted to they wanted to describe it as an adaptation. It must exist for some good reason. And so the first idea was, well, you know, during intercourse, all of these microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, other pathogens, enter the reproductive system. And maybe menstruation is a way to clean your system out. Oh my gosh, and all sorts of people piled on. They really didn't like that idea. It actually wasn't until another biologist tested it. So basically, one simple experiment was, well, how many bacteria are in your reproductive tract before and after menstruation? And it's about the same. If anything, you have more after your period than before. So that didn't quite make sense. She actually, the woman who tested it, came up with her own idea. And this goes back to something you just said about energy. So it actually does require a lot of energy to have your endometrium, your lining of your uterus, in that transformed state. And so her idea was, well, it takes less energy to build your uterine lining up, transform it, and shed it than just keeping it transformed.
Ah, okay. So that gets me maybe to another question, which is for animals that don't menstruate, what is their strategy?
Right. So this is a great question. There is no transformation happening. And so that's why that hypothesis didn't actually make sense. It wasn't like menstruation was a solution to this problem. So it was a great idea. Another problem with the idea was, you know, if you kept your endometrium transformed, if you kept the lining of your uterus transformed, you couldn't get pregnant in the first place. So, you know, the uterus has so many different functions over the course of the menstrual cycle. And for the sperm to find the egg, that requires one set of conditions. And then for the, you know, embryo to actually implant into the uterus requires a different set of conditions.
Okay.
So that was wrong.
Who else? All right. So that was wrong. Who else menstruates?
Yes. So this is a good question, and I think it helps us figure out why we menstruate. So humans are not alone. In fact, most higher primates, so most monkeys and apes, menstruate. So that isn't really surprising because we're all related. So we probably came from an ancestor that menstruated. But then you have this random smattering of species outside of the primates that menstruate. So get ready to be shocked.
Okay.
The spiny Egyptian mouse,
okay.
Which is the only rodent. There are thousands of species of rodents. Only one menstruates.
Oh, only one.
Only one.
Wow, who figured that out?
Right. Actually, a group in Australia figured it out.
Okay.
A few species of bats. And the elephant shrew, which is, you probably don't know much about it, but it is related to elephants. It's actually in the group of mammals that the elephants belong to. So very, and I'm not sure if you're seeing the slide, but this is very different parts of the family tree of mammals.
Okay. Okay.
So I think part of the reason people were missing why we menstruate is that they were not comparing these menstruating mammals, because there is one thing in particular. We have a lot of things in common, but one thing in particular that we have in common. And it is, so we talked about what happens in the human menstrual cycle. So we build our lining, our uterine lining up, transform it. And then the thing about that transformed endometrium is that its lifeline is progesterone. So it needs progesterone to keep doing what it's doing. And if a woman doesn't get pregnant, at the end of her cycle, her progesterone levels drop very quickly.
Right.
And so that lining, if it transforms and if progesterone levels drop, you're going to get a period.
Got it.
And so that's actually what all menstruating species have in common. We all transform our uterus every cycle, regardless of whether we get pregnant or not. In most species, it actually happens when the baby's actually implanting. So that actually makes more sense. So invest all that energy in transforming your uterus for pregnancy, when there's actually a pregnancy, right? So implant and then transform, but menstruating species don't do that. So I think the question has to be reframed. It's really not about menstruation. It's about this transformation. So why do we transform our uterus? That's really the question to answer.
Okay, so why do we? Let me ask you a question. Why do we transform our uterus?
So the short answer is we don't know, but I think we have two at least really good leads, and I want to sort of take you through the leads, and to understand them, I think we have to go back and compare those menstruating species again.
Okay.
So what are some of the other things that we have in common? One is that we have small litters. So humans have a litter size of 1, sometimes 2, very rarely more than that. And that's actually true of most of the other menstruating species. The spiny mouse is a little bit different. It usually has a litter size of 2 or 3, but that's pretty small for a rodent.
Very small.
Yes. Yeah. So what that means is that we're investing a lot of time and energy in each baby. Okay, so that's one critical thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that we all have very invasive placentas.
Okay, I think we have a slide about this. So probably not a lot of people in the audience have thought about exactly what a placenta is and what it looks like, and invasive is a strong term to use.
Yes.
When we're talking about mothers and babies, but take us through this slide.
Yes. Okay, so this is clearly a pregnancy, a human pregnancy. And so the baby's in the middle, of course, and then on the outside in blue and green, you're seeing the uterus. So the blue is the muscle of the uterus and the green is the lining of the uterus that we've been talking about. And then everything else is made by the baby. So the baby itself, and then some membranes around the baby, and then the placenta, which is, to me, truly the most fascinating organ. So, of course, the job of the placenta is it acts like a conduit. It's basically allowing nutrients and gases to move between the mom and the baby. And so why do I think the structure is so amazing? If you look at it across mammals, it's wildly different. So a human placenta, like I said, is really invasive. I'll describe that in a second. But then you've got mammals where the placenta just sort of nuzzles up to the lining of the uterus, but it doesn't invade at all. So it is very superficial, and it just sort of waits for nutrients to diffuse from the mother into the placenta, and then the baby, of course. So this is really fascinating. If you look at most organs across mammals, they're the same. Even the brain looks roughly the same. This structure doesn't. And it actually was very puzzling for a long time. People had a hard time describing it.
You mean it looks the same between humans, but between humans and other species that have placentas, the placenta itself is completely different.
Exactly. So across humans, it looks similar. Thank you for the clarification. But across species, and this is one thing that I do a lot, is I'm looking to see, well, what does a placenta look like in a cow? What does it look like in a dog? And it's very different. And so, on the one hand, you've got really superficial, and then you have, everything in between. So superficial, moderately invasive, highly invasive. And it turns out that the menstruating species have, there are many species that have invasive placentas, but the menstruating species, it looks like their placentas are even more invasive. And so one idea on why menstruation evolved. Well, menstruation evolved because this transformation every cycle of the endometrium evolved. And that, we think, may have been a protective device for the mother. So obviously the placenta is evolving in all these different species, and it's not evolving in a vacuum. So as the placenta is evolving, the endometrium the uterus, the lining of the uterus has to evolve in response to what's happening in the baby.
Got it.
So this transformation may have evolved in the mother early. It was almost like a way for her to take some control back over her uterus, because in most other mammals, you have to wait for the baby to implant. And I didn't mention this, but a human placenta is so invasive that if you get pregnant in the wrong place, it becomes a medical emergency. So if you don't have that transformed endometrium sort of restraining the fetus, if you get pregnant in your fallopian tubes, that is a big problem.
It's dramatic and it's a serious problem. So,
Yes.
and this all comes back to how much the placenta invades the mother's tissue.
Yes. So just to give you like a little bit more flavor on that, a human placenta, there are some cells in the placenta that basically they start digging into the uterus. They get through the very superficial layers, and then they're hunting around to find blood vessels. And in the primates, this doesn't just happen in humans, they're hunting around, they find a blood vessel and they rip it open. They don't just rip it open, they actually make the vessels of the uterus wider. And the goal there is to just increase blood flow to the placenta. That baby wants more blood.
Wow. Okay. So this is a window into pregnancy that I really hadn't considered before.
Yes.
But it's fascinating, and it makes me somewhat happy that I don't have children. And that's not something I would normally say.
So there's just one other idea. So I mentioned it's this protective device. There's this other idea. So another job of the transformed endometrium.
And endometrium, you're just talking about the lining.
Lining, yes, the lining of the uterus. Another job of that lining is that it acts like a screen. So it's basically screening out embryos that may be of inferior quality. And there's actually a lot of data on this showing that our transformed linings are really good at detecting embryos that might not make it through a pregnancy, and basically barring it from implanting into the uterus. And this may be very important for species who invest more in each baby, right? So if you have a small litter and you invest, mammals invest a huge amount of energy and time into each baby. I mean, all mammals do, but in particular mammals with small litters. There's a long pregnancy, there's a long period of lactation. That's a long time. And so it's not at all surprising that the female reproductive system would have evolved ways to basically quality control mechanisms. There are many. When we start talking about menopause, we'll get back to this. And so this transformed endometrium is a really good quality control, screener. And so the early screening may have been beneficial to menstruating species for reasons that aren't entirely clear, but I think part of it must be that their litters are smaller. So protective device for the mother, and or I don't think they're mutually exclusive, screening device.
A way to make sure the highest quality embryos are what implant and grow.
Yes, because you can imagine how devastating it is. And this is actually a problem for some women. They because their lining isn't properly transforming, there's a problem with the transformation. It's devastating for them because they get pregnant a lot. So they have no problem getting pregnant, but they have miscarriages pretty late into their pregnancies because the uterus isn't screening embryos as efficiently as it could. And this is, you can imagine, it's devastating emotionally. And in ancestral primates, this would have made that primate not able to have as many kids.
Right. And this gets actually, so that is fascinating. And I did not know that about menstruation. But this gets at a really important thing that I think maybe people who aren't scientists don't appreciate. And that is that understanding questions like this in the context of evolutionary history actually give us clues about, mechanism and what's happening, right? And so, all right, so we've talked about the beginning of reproductive life. Now I'd like to pivot and talk about the end of reproductive life. So, menopause, which is what defines the end of a woman's reproductive life, is truly just when a woman runs out of eggs. So the question of why do we experience menopause from an evolutionary perspective? I think about menopause as having two things that control the timing. One is how many eggs are we born with? And the second is how fast do we go through them in our lifetime? So do you have, why do we make all of our eggs up front?
Yeah,
Let's talk about this.
So here we're going to get back to this idea of quality control. So I think to understand menopause as an evolutionary biologist, this is the first question to tackle. So, we all know that men don't experience menopause. They continue making sperm throughout their life. Humans, women are different, and actually we're not alone. So all female mammals and all female birds make their supply of eggs. Usually they're finished making it by the time they're born. In our case, it happens about halfway through development.
But they don't go through menopause.
They don't go through menopause.
Okay.
And so this is an important question. First, why do we have this strategy of making this pile up front? That doesn't really make sense. Wouldn't it make more sense to use the male strategy?
Yes.
Keep making eggs.
It doesn't make any sense, right? Because we have
Right.
all of these eggs, we store them, and they have to be, pristine quality when we want to use them decades later. So
Right.
It doesn't seem like, off the top of my head, it doesn't seem like the best strategy.
Right.
But what do I know?
So I'm going to tell you why it's a good strategy. So getting back to this idea about how much we invest in our babies, in most mammals, the male, all he contributes is his sperm. In a female mammal, whether it's a human or a dog or whoever, we all have these very long pregnancies and we nurse our offspring. So that greater investment means we care a lot about the quality of each. And so the thing about continuously making sperm is that we know every time a cell divides, there's an opportunity for a mutation to arise, okay? And actually we know that most mutations enter the human gene pool through sperm versus eggs.
That's true. Okay.
So you can think of this stockpiling strategy as really a way, it's like the first and most basic form of quality control. We're basically limiting the number of divisions that our eggs go through in an effort to, preserve their quality.
Right. So every time an egg divides, the DNA is replicated.
Right.
And there's so much opportunity for errors in the message when you replicate. So, okay, that makes a huge amount of sense.
Right.
Fascinating.
So it actually, it evolved for a good reason, this stockpiling, which, is frustrating, especially, when you're later in your reproductive career and you want to have a baby. Like, it is frustrating, but it did evolve for a good reason.
Okay. So let's see. There were a couple of things that struck me about that diagram we looked at the beginning, the evolutionary tree. So the first thing was that the whales that go through menopause, the spore species of whale, they weren't on the same branch, right?
No.
And so they're not on the same branch, which means that menopause definitely evolved independently multiple times, not just in humans, but also in these species of whales. It didn't just happen once.
Right.
So there must be a good reason for it, evolutionarily speaking. The second thing was that there was a monkey on that slide, and it was colored a little funny.
Yes.
So what's up with the monkey?
So to your first point, that's absolutely right. So when we look at these trees and we see these traits popping up in different parts of the tree, that's usually a signal that the trait evolved more than once. So it must have evolved once in humans, probably once in the ancestor of beluga whales and narwhals.
And then for people who don't think about evolutionary diagrams a lot, when something evolves independently, that means it's important and useful.
Yes, so that was the next thing I was going to say. It usually means there's a reason for it. It has a purpose. It doesn't always, but the same is true for menstruation. I mean, that's how we thought about the distribution of those species. Usually it means it's useful, or it was at the time that it evolved. The monkey. So the monkey is not colored in, because there's a lot of debate on whether rhesus monkeys experience menopause, and there is actually debate about other species as well. And the reason is this: many species in captivity often will live longer than their counterparts in the wild. So if there's no one trying to eat you, if you're not starving, you're going to live a little bit longer than you would if you were living a more natural lifestyle. So these monkeys and a couple of other species that are kept in captivity often live a little bit longer, to the point where they will live beyond their reproductive lifespan.
Okay.
And actually, people have argued the same about humans. So,
oh yeah, let's talk about what are the theories that are out there around why menopause evolved. There are many.
Yes.
Let's start with the crazy. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, so the first, piggybacking off of this point that we were just talking about, some people have actually argued that menopause isn't a real trait in humans because we are living so long. And we're living so long because, we take vaccines, we, take antibiotics. So really, with the improvements in healthcare and sanitation, the idea is we're almost like, animals in captivity, in that, we're living longer than we would without all of those medical interventions.
Maybe another way to say that is that the increase in human lifespan over the last 200 years has been exponential compared to what you would expect from normal evolution. And our reproductive span has not had time to catch up.
Right.
So that's one idea.
So I think that's wrong.
I agree. We agree on this.
So I clearly we're living longer, and many of us are living longer. But if you look at human groups that are living more natural lifestyles, so there are still many hunter-gatherer populations around the globe. If you look at how long they're living, yes, many individuals in those groups die young, but the ones that make it to adulthood have a really good chance of living, the women have a really good chance of living into their 60s and 70s.
Right.
So what that tells us is that this trait is old. This isn't like a phenomenon of just the last 200 years. And actually some scientists have looked at the fossil record and shown, we've been living a long time for a long time. So this is not a recent thing. And so why do we experience menopause?
Yeah, what are the other things? Okay, so we're pretty sure that that's not the case. But it does make, on the surface, it is something that people will say because it makes a lot of sense kind of intuitively, but it's probably not true.
Right.
So what other things exist in the world?
Conversation?
Yeah.
I think the first thing that we should talk about is, so there is something to do with longevity here. So the species that experience menopause, we do have some things in common. So number one, we all live a long time, and in particular compared to really closely related species. So a human and a chimpanzee, who's our closest relative, we experience menopause about the same time, but chimps are often dying before they stop cycling.
Right.
So we have this long life after menopause. And the same is true of these whales. So if you look at closely related species, they are experiencing menopause at a similar time, but the menopausal species is living longer. So there is something here about longevity. And that is something that evolves. We don't need to get too much into that because it's a bit complicated, but lifespan is a trait that will evolve depending on lots of things.
And a woman's reproductive span a female human reproductive span is correlated with her overall lifespan as well.
Yes. And so as a species, you can imagine, starts living longer, what must have happened in elephants, in fin whales, is that they made some changes to their reproductive lifespan as well. So in most cases, you in theory, the solution to menopause is not that difficult. So in theory, you make more eggs up front, which is not hard to do,
Right.
or you slow down the rate that you're going through those eggs.
Exactly. This is, I mean, well, this is what we're trying to do, right? With the center and the consortium and all of the grants that we're funding for scientists around the world. The goal really is to figure out how to slow down the rate of loss or to increase the number of eggs that a woman
Yes.
has, so that we can push out the age of menopause, so that we can increase fertility for younger women, so that we can basically, you know, just cancel if we don't, or make it optional. You know, maybe some women will still want to go through it. It's going to be an individual choice. But that's what we're trying to do, is to
Yes.
mimic essentially what's happening in those
fin
other
whales.
species.
Yes, and
Yes.
actually that should be a line of research, is studying how is it that fin whales and elephants manage to solve this problem, because it is, both in theory and in practice, it's solvable.
It's solvable, and that is why we have you as part of the center, Deena. No question about that. Okay,
so it's solvable, but we didn't solve it, and killer whales didn't solve it, and so the question is why.
Right.
And so again, we don't have a solid answer, but there are so many ideas, and so I just want to take you through some of those.
Mhm.
And I think it helps, as we talk about these ideas, to think about costs and benefits. So often when we're talking about the evolution of a trait, we're talking about what the benefits might have been, what the costs might have been, and how that cost benefit ratio might have been different. Because really, as an evolutionary biologist, what I want to answer is, why do these few species experience menopause, but all these other species don't? So that's the question. And really the answer is going to be the benefits versus the costs were different in those species versus all the other mammals that don't experience menopause. So we can start with the benefits, because I think that's a little bit more intuitive. So what might the benefits of menopause be? Probably the most well-known hypothesis on menopause is called the grandmother hypothesis. So we're going to be talking about grandmas.
Mhm.
And really that hypothesis is not about why we stop cycling at 50. That is something we inherited from our ape ancestors. What the hypothesis tries to explain is, why do we live longer? So does that make sense? So menopause is 50 is something we inherited, that was already there. And the new trait in humans was longer life. And so that's what the woman who really developed this idea, her name's Kristen Hawkes,
Mhm.
and she worked with this tribe of hunter-gatherers called the Hadza. And she made some observations about the Hadza. So they live in these very close-knit groups. That's another trait, by the way, that we have in common with these whale species, is that we live in these really close-knit social groups, multi-generational. Okay, so that provides the opportunity for older individuals and younger individuals to interact and help each other out.
We also, as a species, you know, when we're born, we're more helpless in some ways than a lot of other species, right? Our human babies need a lot of attention and training that some other mammals and species don't need. Deer, for example, we see them born here at the buck all the time in the spring. And you know, they stand up and start walking around, and they know to eat the grass, and they know a lot of things. They're born with a lot of things already happening, whereas human babies need a lot of help and training.
Oh yes, and that is, you know, there's a suite of traits in humans: menopause, longevity, the fact that our babies are born so helpless, the fact that they need to be, childhood is much longer in humans than even in other primates.
Is it almost like the different phases of life, development versus adolescence versus young adulthood and old adulthood, they all scale?
Yes, the one thing that doesn't fit in that pattern is when we wean our babies. So we actually wean them, and this is related to this hypothesis. We wean our babies much, much earlier than a chimpanzee. So let's get back to the Hadza. They live in these close-knit groups, and what this woman, this anthropologist, noticed is that the Hadza grandmothers have a really important job in these groups. And that job is basically, so a big part of their diet are these tubers. They're like sweet potatoes. And so these Hadza grandmothers are digging these tubers up. they comprise a big part of the diet of the Hadza. And they're processing them. I mean, you can imagine it's hard to process this hard sweet potato. And they're feeding their grandchildren. Okay. And so this observation led her to this idea about human longevity, which I'm going to take you through. Her idea was that in the past, there were women who maybe lived a little bit longer. This is normal. This is part of, populations. There's always variation in certain traits. So some of the women in these ancient populations were living a little bit longer. And they evolved this new behavior. And this new behavior was caring for grandchildren. And these women did better than their peers who weren't doing that. Okay. They left more grandchildren than the women who weren't helping their grandkids.
So better in an evolutionary sense.
Better in an evolutionary, their genes won. That's exactly right. And so when you say their genes won, that means that the genes involved in that behavior were passed on to the grandchildren. And so then the grandchildren, when they become grandparents, have that behavior too.
Right.
And so this over time, according to this hypothesis, completely transformed the trajectory of our species. So we started living even longer. We continued, this cooperative behavior was reinforced, and that became like a bigger part of, group life. Longer childhoods. The longer childhood lets the body grow bigger. It lets the brain grow bigger. So all of these traits that are very important. It allowed women to start weaning their children earlier. So according to Kristen Hawkes and a lot of other folks who agree with her, menopausal grandmothers transformed humans, completely transformed, the evolution of our species. But of course, it's never that simple. So, if you study, and so one of the tests of this hypothesis is you go into a group of humans. Also, these tests have been done in whales, and there is some support for the hypothesis. And what does that look like? Well, you go in and you see, does the presence of a grandmother translate to more grandchildren? So that's one easy test. And in some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. And so that's, the challenge. And part of that, I'm sure, is that people live differently. So in some groups, the grandmother lives near their grandchildren. In other cases, that's not the case. And we, unfortunately, don't have a good sense of what the precise composition of ancient human groups was.
Well, so, so it sounds like the grandmother hypothesis might be partially right.
Yes.
And that maybe, when we're talking about taking this from the intellectual framework that we're discussing right now to, thinking about why women go through menopause, bringing it back to a more practical level for people watching this webinar, the idea that maybe just having a different context, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I can tell you personally that my kids' grandmothers help me out a lot. So for me, it's really important. So that, I need the help, but our lives are so different than they were, when these traits were evolving. So, when the context changes, those benefits and costs also change. Right. And, I didn't get into some of the costs, but that's part of the story too. So I don't know if we have time to talk about that, but
maybe. So I guess the question is, I think we should talk about some of the costs quickly. And
sure.
Then are there any other hypotheses that you think might be contributing to to this idea of why women go through?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're related to the costs.
Okay.
So, and they're not the costs of stopping reproduction, because we know in terms of, thinking as an evolutionary biologist, those are obvious. You're not passing on more of your genes, but actually the costs of continuing to reproduce. Okay. There are costs associated with that. I think an obvious one is, it might be harder for an older female to actually go through a pregnancy and childbirth safely. Sure. And there is some evidence, in humans today that the risks of during pregnancy go up as you get older. There are some other costs. I would say the biggest one that has actually been studied a lot is that potentially in these ancient human groups, there was a cost of older women reproducing at the same time as younger women. And that specifically is mothers-in-law and their daughters-in-law.
So resources.
Resources for pregnancy. Now, we know that you need more calories when you're pregnant. You need more calories when you're nursing. It's easy to get those calories.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's way too easy to get those calories.
It is a little bit too easy. Okay.
But you can imagine in these groups in the past, there is not an unlimited supply of food. And so anything, and we think that humans were sort of communally putting food into a pot. And so you can imagine any food you're taking for yourself might be coming at the expense of, food for someone else. And so, depending on how people are related in the group, you might be willing to fight really hard for those calories, or maybe it's a better solution if you're a grandmother. Mm-hmm. And you're related to those other babies. Those other babies are your grandchildren.
Right.
Right? Maybe the solution is, well, I'm going to stop reproducing and I'm going to invest in taking care of my grandchildren, because that's an indirect way of passing on your genes. They're not your own children, but you still share genes with your grandchildren, right? 25%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so what argues against the grandmother hypothesis?
I think the problem with the grandmother hypothesis is it doesn't explain why we didn't we evolve a later age at menopause. So yes, it might explain why we live longer, but it doesn't explain why we had to stop. Right. I mean, that clearly can evolve. It evolved in elephants. It evolved in fin whales. You can either make more eggs or slow down the rate that you go through them. So why didn't that happen in our species? There has to be a reason, and it probably has to do with those costs. There must have been some costs associated with continuing to have children. Right. And so it's that cost benefit ratio again that probably was different in species that have menopause and species that don't.
Okay, so that's where we are. And that's why you are still actively working in this space. And it might not be obvious to everyone in the audience, but I think answering this specific question, why do human females go through this reproductive decline in midlife, this is going to facilitate understanding actually the mechanisms that are operating there that we need to solve in order to solve this problem in human females. So understanding evolutionary context actually is really important for the basic research that we're doing at the bench every day. So, okay, Deena, before we cut to the questions from the audience, I wanted to point out that we call you our writer in residence. And we do that because Deena is working on writing a beautiful book that is for the general public that I'm very excited to read. So can you tell us a little bit about what your book is about?
Sure.
Who's going to read it and when is it coming out?
Yes. So I'm very excited about this book. I'll tell you, the idea for it really came when I was pregnant with my first son. And it was at a time where I was studying the evolution of pregnancy. So I was like experiencing this, new crazy experience for the first time, and actually studying, why all of those things were happening to my body. So that was when the idea sort of popped in my head. Of course, life happened, and so I sort of put it on hold for a while. But that, the idea came because I thought, I love understanding, these deeper why questions, so everything we've been talking about today. Why do we experience periods? Why do we experience menopause? I think women want to know the deeper context. I mean, we don't think they do. I don't think we have all the answers, but I think anyone, even a man, should be able to pick up my book. And I'm sort of a stickler about language, so I want to make it really accessible, because I know for myself, if I'm reading something that's not in my field, language can sort of, scare me off a little bit. And so I imagine that is also true for, non-scientists. So I'm trying to explain all these deeper questions. So menopause is a chapter in my book, periods are a chapter in my book, but I cover lots of other topics: pregnancy, motherhood,
other parts of female physiology.
other parts of female physiology. So these are all things that I tackle in the book. I'm trying to be accessible. I'm trying to, it's very personal. So I'm trying as much as I can to make it fun and, you know,
I think it's going to be amazing. So when can we expect this book?
Yes. So my editor is expecting a draft of the book in a couple of months.
Okay.
So I have to finish writing it first, and then there's going to be an editing process and so on. So in about a year.
Okay. All right. So stay tuned. We'll remind everybody about this. We wanted to address some of the questions from the audience. So let's see. Have you looked at the correlation between the aging rate of reproductive human cells and menstruation energy usage?
Great question. No, I haven't.
And do you know if anyone else has?
I don't know. I not off the top of my head, but that's a great question.
Okay, and then from the same person, is there correlation between brain size or cognitive abilities and that species having menopause? Like, is it just the smarter species? I think the answer is no, because dolphins aren't on that list.
Right. So I don't know of any correlation. I would say that there, you know, the species that experience menopause are all intelligent. More critically, they're all very social. So I think the social piece of it is probably more important.
Mm-hmm.
There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, yes. But back to the topic of periods. So some people have wondered, well, why do some species have such an invasive placenta? Mm-hmm. And that's one answer was, well, maybe humans needed it to make big brains, right? So mm-hmm. more nutrients, bigger brains. But it turns out that that is not correct, because dolphins, for example, all of those whale species have the most superficial placenta out there. Mm-hmm. So there is no invasion.
And big brains.
And very large brains, you know, on par with, you know, we talk about the brain versus the body size. So both the actual brain size and also relative to the size of the body is huge in those species that have very superficial, nice placentas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from Afaf. Do we have answers to how increasing the production of eggs or slowing down their aging rate would affect the onset or the end of menstrual cycles? And would these changes affect other systems in the body?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a complicated question.
Yes.
There's a lot of parts to it. And I think, you know, we're talking about eggs as if they're existing in isolation, but eggs are actually produced in the ovary, which is itself an incredibly complex dynamic tissue that has all of these different cell types and different structures that undergo this dynamic remodeling. We talked a lot about the uterus and the lining of the uterus changing every month, but the ovary also goes through this dynamic remodeling. And so I think the answer is that yes, if we, you know, probably there's a chicken egg question. Do we change the environment that the eggs are in, and in that way, you know, change the number or the rate of egg loss? And then conversely, do the eggs being better then have an effect on the environment? And I think that the answer is that the conversation probably goes in both directions.
Right. I will say that, you know, messing around with probably not the supply as much, but the rate that you are going through your eggs could be dangerous. So it's possible that that doesn't happen, because it could affect your fertility earlier in your life. So if you slow down that rate, maybe it becomes harder. That means that there are fewer eggs.
Well, but okay, I'm gonna challenge you on that.
Yeah, sure.
We're losing 1,000 eggs per cycle.
Yes.
Now, do we really need to recruit 1,000 eggs to ovulate one? I think the answer is probably no.
Probably no.
We could probably, even if we just change that to 500.
Sure, but we don't know, right? So this is something that needs to be studied.
But this is, these are active. I would say this is active. This is an area of active research that we're working on and funding. So stay tuned.
Yes.
Yeah. A few other questions. Since it's not the case that all species who menstruate undergo menopause, can we review maybe some of the ideas why there's that disconnect there? Just to kind of encapsulate everything we just talked about.
Sure. So I mean, those two traits, I really think about them very independently. And there is, other than humans, there isn't really an overlap. So I would say for menstruation, there likely was a very good reason why species that menstruate started transforming their uterus every cycle. There were certainly costs of doing that. The benefits must have really exceeded those costs, and it explains why it evolved in this, unusual distribution of mammals and not everyone else.
Right.
I mean, it's about 1% of mammals that menstruate. And with menopause, it's really a different set of issues and a different set of benefits and costs. And menopause, really, I think we have to think a lot about the social context of when that trait evolved, because I think that's a key part of it. So, many of the menstruating species are not quite as social as, some of the whales.
Right. One thing that's clear, though, is that it's not a biological imperative. It is not necessary for us to thrive, to go through menopause, and so that is truly why we're trying to understand how to slow it down. And to do that, we have to first understand why it happens. So the questions are very basic. They require a lot of scientific research to get done, and that's what we're doing here. So there's a question that I want to end on, which is a little bit bigger, which is there a focus on reducing disease in women who are in menopause? And that's true. When the ovary stops functioning, which is essentially what happens in menopause, there's a whole orchestra of chemicals that include things like hormones that we know about, like estrogen and progesterone, but there's a whole host of other things that are made by the ovary that signal to the brain, signal to other reproductive organs that are important for overall female health. So separate from fertility, the idea that we want to slow down menopause or get rid of it entirely does really hinge on this idea about increasing a woman's overall health, because going through menopause in midlife is the worst thing that can happen to a woman's body, a healthy woman as well. So the rate of aging essentially increases in a woman's body after menopause. So the reason that the center and the consortium are called the Global Consortium, or the Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality, is that equality piece is really important for us. So we think about the fact that a woman goes through this reproductive decline in the middle of her life as an inequality, that it changes her overall health, that it is something that impacts her decisions about career and family planning that men don't have to go through. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing. So I would encourage anyone who doesn't know about these initiatives at the Buck Institute to visit our website. So that's buckinstitute.org/GCRLE. And then we're talking to you today on the OVA Hour webinar, which is a membership group that we put together to encourage people to stay connected, to learn about what we're doing. We wrote a white paper that's also on our website, and you can find it there. But we'll have this webinar where I'm talking to different people who are working on different aspects of reproductive aging every month. So Thursdays at 11 a.m. Next month, we have a conversation with Dr. Lizelle La Follette, who some of you may remember from some of the earlier webinars. We're bringing her back because we want to talk to a clinician about things like biomarkers and diagnostics and clocks, thinking about what's available to women now. How can a woman understand where she is along her own reproductive span trajectory? Because this is something that's so different at the level of the individual. The age at which a woman goes through menopause is very different between individuals. And, we genuinely don't know what a good marker or what a good clock is, and we're actively funding research right now to discover those things. But we want to talk about what's available, what's out there, what the myths are, and what sorts of things women can do right now in conversation with their physicians to figure out where they are in their fertility landscape. But with that, I'm going to thank Deena for joining us. This was a fascinating conversation. We're all looking forward to your book, and I'll say goodbye.
Bye. Yes. Pleasure being here.
Thanks for joining us.